Good morning. Welcome to the first in a series of sector webinars SASB is putting on. We're starting with the transportation sector today. I'm Michael Kinslick, head of the standard setting organization at SASB. I have with me Nashat Moin, our transportation sector analyst. Just a couple reminders. First, please submit any questions you have through the window on your screen. And we will have the slides and recording available for review afterwards. We're going to walk you through a quick overview of SASB's approach to standard setting. Then I'll pass it over to Nashat to go into a little more detail on the transportation sector, the standards there, and then we'll move on to next steps in our development process and finish up with Q&A. So first I want to start with the basic premise behind SASB, which is to focus on material information that companies should report on sustainability issues to meet their existing regulatory requirements. So for us, we take the U.S. Supreme Court definition of material information as that which would present a substantial likelihood that the disclosure of the fact would alter what a reasonable investor would view of an organization given the total mix of information available. Our standard setting process, looking at from the top down, is designed to produce standards that are material, decision useful for investors, and cost effective for issuers to produce. We start with an approach that looks deeply at evidence, is based on industry specific factors, and market informed from an investor point of view. We filter this through topics that look across different areas of sustainability issues. These are things that issues like water issues or climate change or human rights. We look at the different ways those issues affect the given industries in question and then design metrics that represent those issues in a standardized way so that investors can compare companies easily and effectively. The SASB standards and metrics are designed for inclusion directly into the mandatory public filings, the 10K report. We take a narrow view of the issues that we think are most relevant and material for investors to take a look at. So this is a subset of the total issues around sustainability that you might find in a sustainability report or a corporate, an integrated corporate report. So our process started with a very wide view, and then we filtered these issues down, looking at whether and how they were material to company performance. We had a reasonably high bar of 75% of agreement between issuers and investors in determining which topics made the ultimate cut for inclusion in our standards. And then now we're at the stage of ensuring that these issues are material and relevant for companies and investors through our next, which we'll talk about later, in our ongoing process of review. I just want to point out that these are issues that move across industries and across subjects. So we have a few examples here of the kinds of topics and how they would affect valuation. They can affect companies' revenues, if either positively or negatively. If a company is designing products for the future, they can affect companies' operating costs and around compliance with regulation or underlying labor costs, depending on how they structure their business and respond to the challenges in the market. Companies that have a poor record on accident and safety management might find themselves facing a higher cost of capital than their peers due to the inherent unknown risk in that organization relative to others. And then, finally, you can see valuation effects on assets and liabilities, brand impacts to companies that fail to properly ensure compliance, or just an actual liability for environmental performance should you have a large accident that needs to be mitigated. So I'm going to pass it off to Nashat to go in a little deeper on the issues that are affecting transportation.
Thank you, Michael. So just a brief overview of what it means for us here with transportation. So transportation at SASB includes about 8 industries, ranging from automobiles and auto parts, which are more traditionally manufacturing, all the way to different service providers. We have the car rental and airlines industries, which are servicing customers, and also your marine, rail, road, which are basically kind of freight carriers. And across all of these industries, while we have very specific industry issues, which I'll show you shortly, there are really 2 main themes that show up. Basically, it's about fuel use. What are the greenhouse gas emissions? What are the air pollutants that are coming out of fuel use for all of these transportation industries? And safety, thinking about road safety, airline safety, rail safety. And so these are the 2 main themes that keep showing up across the industries. Just as an overview here, you'll notice even though I spoke about 2 main themes, for each of the 8 industries, there's a unique set of issues that impact that industry. And that's one of the key strengths of SASB is the industry specificity. So here, no need to try to read these, but what I'm trying to show is you have anywhere between about 2 issues, say for car rentals, to all the way up to 6 issues which we've identified for auto parts. And you can see a little bit of clustering, for example, on the right 5 columns, the issue of fuel use is kind of recurrent throughout these transportation industries. And then if you look at the bottom where we're looking at leadership and governance, accident and safety management is an issue that keeps coming up. So this is the type of analysis that we've done at SASB, regularly for each of our 79 industries. Here we're taking a look at the 8 transportation sectors. So the top bar is a summary of how often we're seeing these issues that SASB has deemed likely material for the industries, how often these issues are showing up in company Form 10Ks. And so for transportation, we looked at the top companies. Here is an analysis of 56 companies. And relatively speaking, transportation is not doing too terribly. But what do all these bars mean exactly? So the red bar, which is on the left here, is basically telling you that those are the issues that are not showing up in Form 10Ks. So that's actually not a high percentage. Just over 10% of the issues are not being disclosed on. The salmon-colored bar then shows issues that are being discussed, but in a very generic way. So you may not be able to distinguish when you're reading such disclosure what industry even it belongs to, because it's just discussed in a very general manner. Next, the gray bar shows where companies are discussing the issue in a way that's pretty specific to the industry. But lastly, on the right here are company disclosures using very specific metrics on company performance, which tells you a more detailed picture of how a company is managing and performing on an issue. And to be honest, this one chart here can actually summarize what SASB's goal is. We would like to go from these red and salmon-colored bars, and we would like to see metrics and very specific company standardized metrics for disclosures on material sustainability issues. And then if you were to drill down on any of these lower bars here, which are actually looking at each industry, you can see the disclosure quality varies across the industries. So for example, if you look at car rental, of course we're just looking at 2 companies here, but all of the issues are disclosed upon in very industry-specific way. And if you look at the bottom with road transportation, that's another industry where all of the issues that SASB has identified is already being disclosed in Form 10Ks. But I'd like to take a little bit closer look at the second bar from the top here, which is automobiles. So we've actually looked at each specific issue. So this is what's going into each of those bars that we saw in the earlier chart. For each of these specific issues, how often are companies reporting on these? So we can see product safety and labor relations in automobiles as issues that companies all disclose upon and use either industry-specific language, or company-tailored metrics. On the other hand, material sourcing is one where over 70% are not disclosing at all, and the rest who are disclosing are using very boilerplate language. So what do the provisional standards for transportation include? As I showed this graph before, this is the set of topics that are covered in the provisional standards for transportation. As Michael mentioned, after we select each of these topics, we have then handpicked metrics to illustrate how this issue affects company performance and how investors can analyze and benchmark companies. So here's a sample of these metrics. So for the topic of safety, you see how safety is measured across 3 different transportation industries. On the left, we have automobiles. We're also looking at marine transportation. And on the right, we have rail transportation. And you can see we have identified not one, but in many cases, 3 to maybe 4 or 5 metrics to actually capture full performance on an issue. Because we at SASB know that any one metric by itself doesn't tell the whole story. So if you look here, just even across comparing one of these metrics across each of these industries, you know, for example, in automobile, safety may be measured by the percentage of 5-star safety-rated cars that a manufacturer is producing. Versus in the shipping industry, it would be the number of recommendations, which are the result of some inspections. Similarly, in rail, we basically look at how frequently a rail company is inspecting their rail lines in order to ensure safety. So this is an example of the kind of research that goes on behind each industry, and this really summarizes it at a very high level. Mainly, you see for the airlines industry, each of the 4 topics that did make it into the provisional standards, and a very high-level summary of the evidence of interest and the evidence of financial impact that we looked at. So for example, if you look at the first issue here of environmental footprint of fuel use, first you see the heat map, the HM score of 97. So that's a very high score of how often this issue is being talked about in legal documents, in news, in company filings, and other reports. Next, we have the industry working group results. What this tells you is for environmental footprint of fuel use, 100% of the industry working group members, which were comprised of market participants, corporations, and other stakeholders, 100% of them thought this was an important issue for airlines to manage. And in fact, they ranked it #1 in priority. So as a combined result of that, the evidence of interest, or EI, is very high for this issue. And next, we've identified the evidence of financial impact, or mainly the main channels of impact. As you recall earlier, Michael showed a chart that identifies issues and the main channels of impact. And we have done that systematically for every single issue in every single industry. So this is an example of the kind of disclosure quality that we look at. Here I was describing the red bars, the salmon-colored bars, and moving into the dark gray bars, which were indicating metrics. So what do we mean by metrics? Here's actually a real disclosure from the fiscal year 2013 filings for the automobiles industry on the topic of product safety. On the left here, we have a pretty generic but industry-specific language speaking about the potential impact of any recall on potential material impact of any recall on this company. Next, we have another disclosure from another company that actually identified how much their current liabilities for policy, product warranty, and recalls were for the year. And that was a $2.9 billion amount. However, it's really hard to compare, even when companies use or disclose this kind of information, what's being actually included in this calculation, how much of this is warranty versus actual recall costs. Are companies doing this in a standardized manner? Are these comparable numbers? So lastly, on the right side, you see SASB metrics. For example, I had showed you earlier the percentage of safety models with 5-star safety ratings, along with other metrics that give you a total picture of how these companies are performing. In addition, if you have ever looked at any one of our standards, each of these metrics is followed up by a detailed technical protocol, which ensures that any company reporting using these standards would be reporting it in a standardized manner that would be comparable to its peers. Additionally, there are normalization factors that we have included in our standards, which accounts for things like company size, which might account for different performance. So this is an example from a more recent Form 10K where one of the SASB metrics was actually disclosed by, as you can see, General Motors here. Many topics and, of course, the metrics that we have chosen are actually things that companies are already managing and already disclosing on. And here you can see a great alignment between what companies SASB has recommended for disclosure. So so we have not only the recall-related charges, which they have included, which is a dollar amount, but also the number of vehicles recalled, which is the direct SASB metric. So this kind of data that I've showed you in the previous slide with very specific recall numbers actually doesn't exist in all Form 10Ks. I went kind of behind the scenes to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to find out recall numbers for each of these automakers and kind of compared that with their number of vehicles sold just to normalize it and give some more context to these numbers. What this basically shows you is with the right information, investors would really be able to compare safety performance across companies. And this is something that is already actually available, but not easily available to an investor. For me to find this information took a few hours of my time, and that's only for one metric out of the many issues that a company has to manage and out of the many data points that an investor would be looking at. And so what SASB would enable investors to do is to really access this information very easily and in a standardized form. So next up, Michael will be taking us through the process, but before that I want to show you what are these topics that we're going to be discussing in this current phase. So we're in a phase of consultation, which Michael will talk to you about, but what are the questions that we need answered from our industry participants and investors? For example, there's one topic that recently came up in the news. I'm sure you've all heard about the Volkswagen scandal that happened, but basically what it did was raise the question of whether automakers are actually complying with non-GHG emission requirements. In our past research before the scandal came out and when the initial provisional standards were released, from our research we had determined that this was basically a matter of compliance. If you're not able to be compliant, you wouldn't be able to sell these vehicles in the market to begin, which is different from how greenhouse gas emission standards are set. And so based on this current news, we've determined that we probably would like to include an additional metric in addition to the current metrics on this topic on how companies are actually managing non-greenhouse gas emissions, especially as the testing is about to be updated and there's a lot more new developments in the market. So we want to make sure that SASB standards are always evolving and keeping abreast with what's going on in the market and trends that we're seeing. In contrast, we have another metric. This one is for airlines, where we had included a specific metric on fuel hedging, which is a common practice among airlines. And we have received some feedback as to the perhaps the usefulness of it or how investors would be using it. And we will put this up as a question to see whether we should be taking this out of our provisional standards. And so, we have both sorts of proposals going out into the market right now, and we're going to be gathering all of this feedback in this current phase. And next, Michael will take you through the next steps.
Thanks, Nashat. So back in April, SASB published the final provisional standards for the infrastructure sector. We are now in a process of engagement with the market, with issuers, with investors, to look at the provisional standards, look at what might need to change, be added, be dropped, and move towards final codification of the SASB code. This process, this chart here on our rules of procedure is lots of arrows and boxes, but we are putting in place essentially an independent standards council that will have independent oversight of the standards setting process. That standards council will also have a standards oversight committee of the SASB board overseeing its activities. And then the standards setting organization, Nashat and the other analysts and myself and the team here, is really the linchpin of the information flow around the development of the standards, modification and maintenance of the standards between the Standards Council and the market intermediaries and users of the standards there at the bottom. So we're taking those hypotheses for change, and we'll be presenting an agenda for change to the Standards Council when it is formally seated early next year. And this period of 2016 and 2017 is when we're going to be engaging in deep consultation with issuers, investors, and others to test the materiality, decision usefulness, and cost effectiveness of the standards. We're going to be putting forth a cost-benefit analysis to ensure that the standards are cost-effective, and we're going to be ensuring that all the voices that we need to reach are going to be heard in this process. SASB has a number of advisory partners that work with us to help companies as they move towards adopting the standards and using them. And we work in an array of ways to present and promote use of the standards with data providers and partners via our materiality map on the website, through guidance documents like our engagement guide, implementation guide, and through products like our recently launched Standards Navigator. So I'm going to encourage you again to jump in and jump in with questions that you might have, and we'll be getting to those in just a moment. All right, so our first question for Nashat: how do driverless cars feature in the SASB transportation standards?
Yeah, that's a great question, Michael. Driverless cars may be here sooner than we think. In SASB standards, we already look at one of the key issues for driverless cars, which is to do with safety. However, the way that we're currently measuring safety in terms of cars are with the number of recalls and complaints, which would capture driverless cars, but we may want to think about, as more than driver-assisted mechanisms come into play, how those might be incorporated. But just to give you context, we're not the only ones who are kind of coming up on these standards. The Obama administration recently released some proposed guidelines because regulations take so long to actually implement. And so we're going to be keeping abreast on all of those standards to make sure that our standards are up to date.
Great. So next question, how will the Paris Agreement affect the standards for the transportation sector?
Yeah, so the Paris Agreement is definitely focusing on all sorts of ways that we can get to climate change. One interesting point in that is actually the aviation industry is actually not covered within the Paris Agreement, because the Paris Agreement was focused on national emissions, and international air travel was kind of falling through the cracks. And so the International Aviation Association has actually come together, and this week, by the end of this week, probably as early as tomorrow, they're going to be agreeing on how the aviation industry as a whole is going to be capping those emissions. And so I would argue that SASB standards already capture the emissions and the way the aviation industry is handling it, and we're already seeing a lot of action towards it recently in the market, that it's going to be hopefully a nice outcome in terms of emissions from airlines.
Great. So we have a question on when will the final standards for the transportation sector be published, and I'm going to take that. We will be putting forth our schedule for codification probably in the next few weeks. We're still in sort of final mapping out of the process, and we will let everyone know that not just for the transportation sector, but for the entire SASB code in the next couple, 3 weeks. So please watch this space. Next question. How do the SASB standards affect private companies?
Mm-hmm. So we have actually had involvement from companies outside of the U.S. market, from private companies. Essentially what SASB standards enable you to do as a corporation, regardless of your listing status, is identify the key sustainability issues that are going to be making an impact on your financial performance. And so if there is no investor that this data is going out to, we highly encourage companies to be measuring and benchmarking themselves against their peers, whether they're publicly listed or privately listed. So what you don't, you can't basically manage if you're not measuring something, and so that's what SASB standards enable you to do.
Great. We have a question. How can we use the SASB standards if we're not going to integrate them directly into the 10K? I'll take a little bit of that. We have seen some companies referencing the SASB standards and metrics where they align with them in their sustainability reports. So that is sort of an interim step that some organizations are taking. And it's certainly not too soon to start to identify the information and gather it and start talking to the financial reporting division in the organization about what steps would be necessary to put the standards in place. We recognize this is not going to be an instant process, but it's going to take some time to put controls and procedures in place around the data for the standards and metrics. So it's definitely not too soon to start. And we have one final question, which is how are airlines responding to the new provisions for fuel use on international air travel?
Yes. So while we have different kind of commitments around national emissions, international travel has largely been overlooked. The industry association, as I mentioned earlier, for airlines and other aviation is actually coming together on standards for self-monitoring and self-regulating their emissions. I think the hope is that by 2020 or at least 2025, they would be capping emissions from aviation through a number of methods, including fuel efficiency, using carbon offsets, and other measures that would cap airline emissions.
Great. That's all the questions we've got. I want to thank everyone for participating and Nashat for delivering such a wonderful presentation on our transportation sector and standards. I want to remind everyone these slides and recording will be available and sent out to attendees. And check in soon for the next edition. Thanks all.